look, Britain is a great place to invest. As you just said, there are going to be a lot of announcements apparently about investments, not only by financial firms, but otherwise in the UK. So all of that is good. And I think a second key objective here is to move ahead on the recent U.S.-UK trade deal, which remains incompleted. It's a 5-page heads of terms. It's not yet a real deal. And there's still some important parts of that deal which remain to be filled in, including on steel and aluminum, to see if the UK can reduce those tariffs from 25% and to get an exemption for Scotch whiskey, for example.
There's a number of good points there, in each we'll get into, but you did also mention the timing of this, of course, being awkward with Peter Mandelson, the former UK ambassador to the US, being fired. So how does this complicate the trip? This is clearly a topic that none of the parties are really going to want to get into. Is this a concern that this is maybe going to sour the mood for President Trump as the UK is trying to really ramp up a lot of the diplomacy?
No, I don't think so. Let's not overstate the case. I mean, it is embarrassing for Starmer, but I don't want to get into that, the degree to which vetting did occur. I think the trip is much larger than that. It will be forgotten. There's some very big issues involved here. For example, the nuclear deal, which apparently will be signed, which could be quite a big deal, an important deal, to see how the two countries can cooperate on nuclear power, specifically on small modular reactors, which both of us need to power our economies, particularly the huge energy demands from artificial intelligence. So the trip is much, much bigger than one person.
Start to see a return of that special relationship, the so-called special relationship between the UK and the US following this trip?
Look, the relationship has been special, will remain special for a lot of reasons that your viewers will know about. It's not just military and security, but indeed it's economic, which will be showcased on this trip. The fact that the UK is no longer part of the EU is perhaps part of that, because Trump has a blind hatred for the European Union. But let's not overstate the case, because the UK deal that was struck with the US on trade actually isn't better than the deal that the EU struck. In the media, it is described as being significantly better, but it's not. Without getting into all of the details, the 10% tariff that was struck was on top of the existing UK's WTO tariff, so stacked on top of existing tariffs, which average around 5%. The EU's deal is 15%. But the important point here is, by stacking the 10%, there are some tariff peaks in the United States. One example is cheese, so that in fact the UK in some cases will be worse off. But on the whole, the fact that the UK is not a member of the EU, I think, is obviously good news for Donald Trump, and therefore will add to his desire to be more open in his relationship with Starmer.
And when it comes to tariffs, there's still some questions around the deal with the US, one of those being getting the steel tariffs to zero, and also around whiskey. Do you expect any light to come to that?
Hard to tell. Certainly it's going to be two key points who will be raised. It's important for Starmer domestically and politically. He'll make that point, and I think Trump will probably try to do what he can to make progress on both of those points. There are also some issues of friction here. One of them could be Ukraine. The views of the two countries are quite different. Starmer will be eager to push Trump to be much more specific in his promises to do more in terms of a reassurance force for Ukraine. Because so far a lot has been said, but very little has been delivered. The second point of friction, importantly, is that Trump will try to push the UK to strip out China from supply chains. In fact, there's some interesting language in the U.S.-UK trade deal. But the UK will not want to go too far in that direction, because the UK wants a strong relationship with China economically.
So I want to dig into both of those points that you made about China and then also on Russia. But first off, with China, because we know that there have been talks between the Treasury Secretary Bessent in Madrid, and that Trump will be speaking to Xi now on Friday. So do you expect anything to come from those talks, as we've seen a lot of these tensions ramping up between the US and China?
Really hard to tell. I mean, there's been almost silence with regard to the China relationship. China played its hand very differently from the UK, certainly from the EU, because it has greater leverage than both, even more leverage than the EU because of rare earths and otherwise. So they play their hand in a different way. The EU, in my view, caved essentially in the trade agreement. But now comes the time to see whether progress can be made with China across the board, including on rare earths, on fentanyl, and other issues.
There's also been a lot of talk about whether China is using NVIDIA as a negotiating tool. But also moving on to Russia and Ukraine, as you mentioned there, that Keir Starmer may bring this up with his meeting with President Trump. Do you think this approach could work? Because as you mentioned, Trump has really talked the talk when it comes to Russia. He's threatened sanctions many times, but really stopped short of enforcing them. So I'm curious to get your take on that and whether you think, what you make of the U.S.'s role in trying to broker peace.
Well, Trump has repeatedly said it's now up to Europe, particularly the European Union, to stop buying Russian fossil fuels, which is a fair point because by buying Russian fossil fuels, Europe is financing the war. The bit of the problem there is that the two key difficult countries in blocking consensus in the EU on this issue are Hungary and Slovakia, who are extremely close to Donald Trump. I mean, had it not been for those two countries, I think the EU would have been much faster in cutting imports of Russian fuel from about, I think it's about 20% to close to zero. So if Trump is really serious, he should pick up the phone and call his buddy, Viktor Orban, and tell him stop buying Russian fuel. That is a really core issue. The second is the use of the Russian assets, where here some progress may be made. Von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, in her recent State of the Union address, mentioned a rather interesting new way to use those assets, 200 billion roughly, in Brussels without seizing them, in a rather interesting legal technique. So those are two critical issues. But the third I mentioned is security guarantees. What is it the United States is really willing to do in terms of intelligence and surveillance and reconnaissance, and perhaps even Air Force cover for European countries that are willing to put forward their troops to give Ukraine those guarantees.
When it comes to sanctions, Trump has also called on the EU to enforce secondary sanctions on China and India of up to 100% to force Russia's hand. Do you think this sort of tactic could work?
Well, that's an important point. That's going to be very difficult for the EU to do because, in fact, it's very eager, as I mentioned, to continue to have stable and strong economic relations with China, and second is trying to sign a trade deal with India. So I think there are very slim probabilities the EU will agree to Trump's request to have secondary sanctions, which, by the way, have never been very popular in the EU for obvious reasons. So no, that could be, a source of tension.
All right, thank you so much. That was Anthony Gardner there, the former U.S. ambassador to the EU under President Obama.